Welcome to the GreenPilled Network podcast. If you're just joining us, we're building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive-sum digital systems to the world. This podcast features the people who are doing it, and we publish an episode of about 10 episodes every couple months. This season is Lean Mean Capital Allocation Machines. Capital allocation is the way that we decide how we're going to spend financial resources. With Web3, we can do new, more democratic, transparent, scalable, precise, weird ways of doing capital allocation because now we have blockchains and programmable smart contracts. We can program our values into our money. How can we build crypto economic systems that allocate capital in new, weird ways? What are the coolest experiments? These are the themes of Greenpill Season 4, Lean Mean Capital Allocation Machines. And our guest today is Andy Tudhope, someone who is practicing the weird art of capital allocation. Andy has worked on weird things in crypto since 2014. He built the first fair ranking system on Ethereum while working at Status. He has made some friends at Maker. He wrote and ran the kernel community syllabus with others. And the idea behind Kernel was to give away a new manner of seeing crypto. He created prison art to showcase the better uses of technology that we've created, extended what NFTs could be with sign.kernel.community and the Blue Book. And he has most recently built Honor, a way of implementing wholesome money. And that is what we're here to talk about today on the Greenpill podcast is Andy's philosophy behind Honor. In what ways could we implement more wholesome money? And how can we explore the design space of social credit systems? And what does that mean to Andy? What are his influences? What are his values? I think that this was a really amazing episode. If you've never heard from Andy before, I think that one of the things you'll notice is that he's got this sort of like thoughtful philosopher aspect to him that I think is like really beautiful to listen to in audio form. When I first met Andy in 2017, actually it was 2018, at EdCon, I was just taken away by just the depth of his thinking and not just his philosophy, but the fact that he executes. I mean, he built Honor with his own two hands. And I think that, the most interesting green pill guests are the people who can think about these things a priori, but also can create experiments that create empirical results in how they're used in the world. And Honor.community is one half empirical and one half a priori. So it's always a pleasure to talk to Andy Tudhope, and I think that you're going to really enjoy this episode. Hey, Andy, how you doing?
I'm well. Thanks for having me, Kev.
Yeah, excited to talk about Honor. So what is Honor?
Honor, very simply, is a ERC20 token on Optimism. It looks pretty much the same as your vanilla ERC20, except it has two additional mappings that have to do with how tokens are minted or burned. And in this particular case, it has no set limits, and the idea is that Honor tokens, or HON, can be minted into existence as they are needed and burned out of existence when they are no longer needed. This is an idea that mimics older approaches to money and is particularly influenced by David Graeber's Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology and Death, the First 5,000 Years. It tries to replicate complex social credit systems on a blockchain. And the way in which it does that is it takes the ERC20 standard and says, hey, we can tell a very different story about what this thing actually is. Because ultimately, it's all just memetics, right? It's the stories that we share that inform how we use any given technology. And Honor says, rather than having these ERC20 tokens represent assets, what happens if the tokens themselves are obligations? So having lots of tokens, having a big balance is not necessarily a good thing. It's a measure of your liabilities. And those two additional mappings that are not a part of the standard, what they allow for is consensual transactions. So when you do something for me, you can propose that I take on some Honor tokens. And if I say, yes, Kev, it's wonderful, you've given me a spot on your podcast and I probably should, return the favor in some way, I'll accept some on tokens and then they are minted into existence. And similarly speaking, if I then do something for you, I can either propose that you take on tokens and the same process happens, or I can propose to forgive some of your already existing balance. And there is a little bit of subtlety around the rules for forgiveness. I can't propose to forgive more tokens than I currently have in my balance, is like the big rule. And that very, very simple little tweak in the mechanism makes for sort of endlessly interesting games that can be played with this. If you buy into the notion that tokens need not represent assets, and in particular need not represent assets that give us governance rights over others, which a lot of ERC20 tokens supposedly do just by virtue of the story that we tell about them. And I happen to think that assets which are tradable and which hold governance rights over others most likely mix the worst parts of capitalism and tyranny. So honor is an experiment about how we can undo that and kind of go in the opposite direction and, try and reimagine these very, very rich social networks of credit that Graeber talks about in older communities, but using modern technology.
Well, when I first learned about honor, I thought it was quite provocative that a balance could represent an obligation instead of an asset. And, that's kind of like a big pattern interrupt for me, that if we're programming our values into our money, we could program completely different value sets into our money. And, I'm wondering if you could tell me more about your experience reading about Graeber. I've actually never read him, so I'm curious about that philosophy and just what kind of experiment, what you're hoping to see out of the experiment.
Graeber is an interesting person for many different reasons. And in this context, probably the most important thing to say about him is that as an anthropologist, he came up with a data-driven understanding of the development of money that is almost the direct opposite to what Adam Smith proposed in The Wealth of Nations. Smith tells the story that we begin with, barter for goods. And because of the coincidence of wants problem, we have to try and find some neutral measurement of value that we can trade rather than just like having bread one day or being able to do haircuts the other or having caught a fish this day. So we try and find some neutral medium. Currency emerges from the ability that people find to solve the coincidence of wants. And then when currency fails, then you kind of either return to barter or indeed, like if it succeeds, you get into credit networks. And credit is like the evolution of coinage. That's Smith's story in The Wealth of Nations. And Graeber says it's, in fact, if you look at the anthropological evidence, it's the exact opposite. When you look into so-called primitive tribes that still exist today, and he did his research in Madagascar, but this is true pretty much across the board. When you look at so-called primitive societies that haven't been exposed to coinage and don't barter for things, what you find are complex networks of social credit. And this goes way back in the anthropological and archaeological records. So the book that was published posthumously with an archaeologist, David Wengrow, it's called The Dawn of Everything, discusses the archaeological evidence for this in greater detail than debt did, which was just looking at the development of debt through anthropological data. And it's really funny to have that pattern interrupt, as you say, because we have this baked in notion that it's, barter, coincidence of wants, coinage, credit. And credit is kind of like what happens when there's not enough coinage in circulation. But in fact, it's really the direct opposite. And this is critical to understand because those complex networks of social credit hold such an interesting array of insights when you start thinking about, like, what is the point of coordination? Like, what is the grand purpose for which we try to coordinate, right? Like, how do you come about a narrative that tells a convincing and persuasive story about why coordinate? Because in those complex networks of social credit, money, religion, and culture are all just different facets of the same thing. And that thing is how we share what we perceive to be valuable. Like money, religion, and culture all just come at that central question: how do we share, or how do we communicate about what we perceive to be valuable from slightly different directions, but it's really the same thing. And debt is a book precisely about this, right? Because when you really investigate debt, there's this deep moral ambivalence about it. Like, who is in the moral low ground? Is it the creditor or the debtor? and it really depends on the nature of the relationship and how one responds to the other. It's never predetermined. And in the sense, there's just so much to dig out in terms of the theological underpinnings of the money that we use and the kinds of culture that it supports. Because all of these things are deeply tied together. And Graeber makes the point that, you can go through this progression of asking, like, who am I really in debt to? He asks it on a global level. There's I don't know, what is it now, $300+ trillion of global debt. Who's it owed to? Right? And if we're talking to regens, it's to the future. Is like one very good answer. It's to the faces still under the earth, as the Native Americans call it. But, Graeber's point in raising that kind of question is that you can say, well, if you look at the stories that are told in these sort of pre-coinage societies, it's like, well, you're in debt to your parents, and so you become a parent. And then you're in debt to your teachers, and so you become a teacher. And then you're in debt to the sages, and so you become wise. Right? And then you find that you're kind of in debt to the universe, but perhaps like you are the universe. And then where does the debt go? Right? And so this moral ambivalence at the heart of debt links us deeply into the kind of narratives that inform the culture that we participate in and the sorts of religion that we seem to think are valid. And it might seem a stretch to link religion, money, and culture in this way. But if you look at what I would call like the leading thinkers in crypto about this particular topic, it's very much present. And those people, just to mention like a few kind of projects that are somewhat similar to Honor, at least in their intention, is Cycles.money by Ethan Buchman in Cosmos, and Christopher Go's sort of scale-free money in Anoma. And Ethan was in fact on Bankless a while ago debating David and Ryan about, empires versus city-states. And in that podcast, he makes a wonderful point about, our money, all of it has religious roots, and we need to get serious about that. Not in the sense of trying to be an evangelical or saying that there is like one true money or one true religion. We just have to be aware that the kinds of money we perceive to be most valuable imply very deep narratives about the cultures that we participate and what we really like at root believe in. And the point that he's making in that particular episode, which is something that I really resonate with, and why honor is only minted into existence when it's needed and then forgiven out of existence as it's no longer needed, in the same way that these networks of social credit used to work, is that money is primarily a tool to clear debts, right? And it's only once the debt clearing capacity of your money starts to fail that its function as a store of value becomes preeminent. And if you take the store of value function as preeminent, as the thing itself, it implies a particular narrative which is quite static and authoritarian and hierarchical, whereas money as a clearing instrument implies something much more relational, processional. It doesn't imply that there's one true God or one true standard of money or, in God we trust. It implies a relatedness to others, a horizontality, a plurality that is much more appealing, I think. And it's in being aware of the deeper implications of the kinds of money that we choose to use and transact with that we can come to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the kinds of relationships that we enter into, that we find ourselves participating in. Because I think that this is something that can be quite a cause of cognitive dissonance for a lot of, like, especially regen people in Web3, right? You like hear about crypto and you're like, oh, there's all of this cool stuff that I can do, and there's DAOs and there's the coordination, and oh my gosh, we're going to change the future of money, and it just all sounds so wonderful. And then you actually like start doing it, and it's like mostly people like running like quite complex scams or just doing all sorts of things that are very clearly not regenerative. And that kind of cognitive dissonance is difficult to pass and understand. But if you begin to think quite deeply about, well, what does this form of money, what are the values that are programmed into it, and what does that imply about the underlying narrative, then you can begin to see a little bit more clearly perhaps your own path through the dark forests to the little glades of light where interesting things are happening. And I hope that honor is one of those, right? I don't necessarily, Ethan and Cycles.money, the project that they're working on in Cosmos, is much more, I want to almost want to say realistic than like Cycles is a protocol that plugs right into QuickBooks, which is a commonly used accounting software around the world, and then uses liquidity on the inter-blockchain communication, IBC, to build a graph of obligations and to settle debts wherever it can find them. There is a great degree of elegance in it, but also some very open questions about kind of, well, who gets to settle the debts first? Whose debts get settled first, and for what reason? Quite a difficult one to answer. But, honor is a grand experiment. It's statements left in perpetuity, right? Because these things last a long time. And I don't necessarily think that I need to get the next million users onboarded onto, or billion, what do we say? Next billion users onto blockchains, right? That's not Honor's purpose. It's to stand there as a message in a new kind of technological medium that this is what is possible, right? It's one way of thinking about money. There's so many others. And if we don't open our minds a little bit, then we will end up just replicating the same old stuff that exists in slightly more distributed and perhaps less efficient ways, right? That's not what blockchains are for. It's not to redo the traditional finance system, but maybe like include a few more like geeks this time around. There's something else is at stake here. And my contention is that what is at stake is a culture that thinks about money differently and tells a different story about what is worth believing in.
Yeah, one thing that has been a theme this Greenpill podcast, as we've explored lots of different ways that on-chain capital allocation will be different from the way we've done it, is this idea of returning to our roots. And so we had Scott Morris on to talk about community currencies, and then Will Ruddock to talk about commitment pooling and these ideas of social credit systems that have in many ways been sort of blown away through industrial age money and colonial money. And in what ways could we return to our roots of social credit and mutual debt clearing and just being in relation with each other? Those old ways of sort of managing obligations, and how can we bring those on chain and refresh those now that we have this more expressive medium for doing money? And I guess I'm just noting that that's a theme, and I hope the listeners listening to the last couple episodes will see that theme. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of comments or if you want to riff on this idea of returning to our roots at all.
Well, it's the meaning of the word radical, right? You have this notion that radical means some kind of break or like something completely different. The radical is the roots of the plant. In Latin, it literally means roots. So like to be radical is to go back to the roots. And look, I've spent a lot of time looking at different monetary systems. I've worked in a number of them. I think that there are interesting aspects to locally exchange traded systems. I think I've seen systems that use a functional programming approach to money where you can have namespaces for different coins, and you can have infinitely nested namespaces for different coins between different people at any given time. I thought a lot about circles.uvi, the sort of trust graph. A lot of these things, circles included, and community currencies. Community currencies, like some of them exist in South Africa where I grew up, and, I know a fair bit about them through experience. And they're all still assets. They're all still assets, and community currencies in particular have a half-life that is largely defined by the usefulness of other people in the network. And when the hairdresser leaves, all of a sudden your community currency can no longer get you a haircut, right? And so it kind of begins to lose value. And that becomes, and I'm sure that Will would have said this because it's certainly what they found in Kenya with grassroots economics, right? Like it's enormously difficult to compete with a local community currency in a global market. And, if you look at UBI, it's the same thing. It's like, how do we get assets to people? And I think that that's like, none of that is radical enough, right? None of that is radical enough. And none of it is simple enough either, right? That's why, like, ON is a single contract. There's no complicated protocol. There's no off-chain intents. There's no solver network. There's nothing in it that could be susceptible to MEV. There is no part of it which looks in any way similar to the way that finance is currently handled. Now, this brings with it a number of other problems, right? Because it puts the pricing efforts, how do you value ON totally on the user? There's nothing in the protocol which says ON is worth $1 or $10 or nothing, right? You can make it worth whatever you want. And that's enormously weird and quite difficult for people to grasp. There's a psychological barrier that is inevitably brought up when you do something truly radical, which is not present in UBI or community currencies, because at least they look somewhat legible, because these are assets. These are things that I want. And money is a good thing, right? Like the more money that I have, the better my life is. That's narrative that is pushed by the culture. And we are deeply conditioned in ways that are subtle and difficult to understand for all of us around that. And what Anna is saying is like, forget all of that stuff, right? And even forget what Ethan is doing with debt clearing. And I love Ethan. I worked with him. And I think that Cycles is an incredibly cool thing, right? But like, as I say, when you integrate into QuickBooks and you think about like the debt clearing and it's this whole graph of obligations, like whose debt gets settled first and for what reasons, these are difficult questions to answer. In fact, there's no single right answer to it. And it makes the protocol a little bit messy. Whereas what Anna is saying is like, there's no definition of what the price is in terms of anything else here. And your balance is a measure of your obligations, but how high that has to be in order for me to not trust you and think that you're not creditworthy is left totally up to you. And your transaction history is a measure of your trustworthiness, right? And in the front end for On, which you can find at honor.community, I have a very, very simple algorithm. It's 100 lines long, right? That defines the trust score for somebody. But that algorithm is written in JavaScript on the front end, right? It's not a part of the protocol itself. And the one that I happened to make was the simplest thing that I could think of, which is that if you have transacted with an address that I have transacted with, then you get +1. And if you and I have transacted directly, you get +2 points. And if you have transacted with an address in an amount that's 2 orders of magnitude larger than anything that I have transacted with, you get -1. And like, then the trust score can go up or down infinitely. It's not like out of 10 or some percentage, because that's also the wrong way to think about these things. But the point is that like, you don't have to use that particular method of measuring trust, and you don't have to listen to me about like what kind of balance would suggest that you're not totally creditworthy, because all of these things can be usefully explored in social experiments in different and interconnected networks that think about credit in slightly different contexts because they come from different contexts, right? And this is like the one thing that I think is genuinely interesting about On, as opposed to like what I've mentioned with like scale-free money and Cycles, is that there is a single global symbol, right? Because this is the problem with Circles and some of the UBI and certainly community currencies, right? Is that like, if you have to track more than 2 or 3 currencies, the psychological burden for normal people is too much. They lose interest very, very quickly, and there's like good research on this. Whereas like On is a single global symbol, right? It's like there's only one token, HON, that's it. So you only have to think about that. But how people use it defines any number of interrelated subcommunities in which the price is completely different. And I think that that's very weird. I don't know exactly what the outcome of that kind of thing will be. But what it enables is like a single legible psychological space we're using On to transact, but infinite nuance in terms of the communities that use it and how they define what price they charge for different things. And this is something that is interesting to think about in terms of capital allocation, because, you know, traditionally speaking, we say that the market is the best means of resource allocation that we know. And I think that that's, you know, on a global scale, probably true in the last 500 years. But it's not necessary. It feels more like a local maxima to me than a global one, right? Because the market is never perfect and it doesn't take into account local context. And then trying to like take into account local context has always given us really, really big issues, because it means some kind of like community currency or UBI scheme or something, but they're always local. And they always place a greater psychological burden on people, because now I have to track multiple different kinds of currency, and they suffer from this half-life, like decay problem, because as people leave the network for a more competitive global network, your community currency loses value, or you lose the ability to do different stuff with it. And so that's, to me, what's interesting about like a global ledger is you can have a single namespace, right? Like a single thing to think about, but it can be infinitely nuanced in the ways that it is used, only if you keep the protocol as thin as possible, as simple as possible. And, you know, that's what I did. Whether it's useful in the short term, I'm not sure, you know, because like it's a lot to ask people, right? And in fact, I've had interactions with folks around it where people have got like quite angry, because they're like, no, like money is a good thing. Like, why, you know, like I'm here because, like, long discussion with somebody from India who came from really quite abject poverty. And he's like, I worked so hard to earn money to get myself to where I am. Like, and now you're telling me that, like, no, I'm just going to like make a money that like is an obligation. I'm not interested. That's bullshit. It was a very interesting reaction, you know? And that's kind of what I mean, is that you have two paths, basically. You can either kind of like do the thing that is legible and like make some kind of asset, but try and bake in some like clever logic behind the scenes that makes that asset function in a much more efficient manner. And that's kind of what Cycles is doing. And it's wonderful. Ethan has even said, like, the best kind of money is that with infinite velocity, right? That the actual currency never appears. Right? It's infinite velocity, and it just clears all of the debts constantly. And that's kind of what they're trying to build with Cycles, so that the actual currency never manifests. And I love that. But as I say, I think there are open questions around the order in which things happen, whose debt gets cleared first. But honor is something different, right? And the barrier to it is psychological. And that's why I mentioned the point about the religious narratives, right? Because interestingly, the first word that Jesus says on the Mount at Sinai, when he gives the sermon that is mentioned in Matthew, if you have read a Bible, in the original Greek version, it is metanoia. It says metanoia. He actually talked in Aramaic, but the original Greek version is the first written version of the Bible. And metanoia, directly translated, means change your mind. Right? Change your mind. It's very similar actually to like the Dhammapada, for instance. There's like all is mind. Everything is about how you perceive what is value, because how you perceive what is valuable relates very deeply to then your choices about how you communicate it and with whom you share it. And of course, in the years since that original Greek Bible, the Greek was translated into Latin, and it was translated by a man called Saint Jerome. And Saint Jerome translated metanoia in Greek to penitentia in Latin, from which we get repent, right? And so we have in the English version of the Bible these days, Jesus climbing the mountain saying, repent. A very different thing to change your mind. And I think that's kind of like that's kind of the burden that honor places on people, to change your mind. And it's a really big thing to ask of people, right? That's why I say, like, what success looks like for me is not everybody using honor. I think that's, the pricing efforts and the idea that money is a liability, a bad, quote unquote bad thing, as opposed to something to strive for is really difficult to wrap your head around. But what success looks like is more people recognizing that you can program your values into money and having a more playful attitude toward money, right? Rather than idolizing it and thinking in simplistic ways about it, having a playful attitude. Money is something we can play with rather than idolize. I think that would be really wonderful. And I think we would probably be in a better world with richer culture and better narratives to believe in, rather than the seemingly monocultural and rather gray world that sometimes seems to be just over the horizon,
Yeah, I mean, hearing you talk, I can definitely, it's moving to hear where your vision comes from and how you're actually putting it into practice. And I'm wondering how the first experiments with honor are going. What are you actually seeing tangibly it being used for, and what do you hope to see in upcoming experiments?
Yes, a great question. The first thing that I did was make there's a particular lesson in the kernel syllabus in module 2 called Money and Speech, and it is now token gated by honor. Because the major point about this is that when you have a token that is not an asset used to govern others, but rather a liability, and you use it to token gate content or a chat room, the incentive when people get into that content or into that chat room is not to try and manipulate others and make price go up. It's to find other people to serve so that they can forgive you your obligations. So it seems to me to be a much more pro-social tool for exactly the thing that we want to do, right? Like there is this inherent need in building communities to find a balance between like quality, ethos aligned people and growth, right? You don't just want to kind of open the community up to everybody, but you do want to find some mechanism by which you can filter people coming in so that there is like constant stream of like new ideas and new energy so that things don't stagnate. And one of the solutions that people have come up with is token gating and buyout token. Participate in governance and vote on snapshots and then be a part of our community. But as I say, I think that actually, when you think about the underlying narratives, mixes the worst of capitalism and tyranny. Whereas, if you token gate stuff with honor, then people can get it relatively easily, but they think about it before they get it, because they're like, now I owe someone something, I don't quite know exactly who I owe, perhaps in the case of like the token gated page on kernel, because it's just a little API that proposes that you take on some on, but you still have an obligation, and you need to take on an obligation to read that content, which is all about like the link between money and speech. And that goes all the way back to ancient Sumer and further. The first writing that we have is about debt. It's bills of lading from warehouses in what is now Iran. Interestingly, on that note, just as a random side note, these bills of lading had seals. They were clay envelopes, and they were sealed with a particular stamp. And the stamp often would have a checksum of like all of the stuff that was recorded in the envelope, and then an invocation to God. That whoever broke the seal without due permission would be cursed forever, right? Money and religion have always been intimately linked. And what's fascinating about these seals, I just thought for you, Kev, is that the seals are both a means of, securing the contents of the transaction, the first sort of proto-encryption in those checksums. And because, for instance, we found these Sumerian seals in like Mali, we know that there was trade between Sumer and Mali. And so the seals become not just a measure of ensuring trust in the transaction itself, but also of tracing how far the trust network grows. It's very fascinating. Anyway, so an interesting aside, but Honor is implemented in kernel. And then like a bunch of different people, mostly in Africa where I'm based, are interested in using this. And, there's a few sort of researchers out of the Ethereum Foundation one of whom said 1 on is worth 1 ETH. And he's kind of like, every time he pays people, he sends them on as well. And and now he's sort of like trying to see how people respond to that, and where it leads in terms of like the quality of his relationships.
Yeah.
So it's kind of stuff. It's really bitty. There's lots of like individuals around the place who might have thought about like the history of money and the philosophy of value, and then who stumble upon on, and they're like, oh, let me experiment with this, but nothing bigger scale than that.
I'll be curious I don't know if you have this information, but the EF researcher, the EF employee who pays people and then sends them on at that point, I'm curious to hear if any of those people have realized what it is and have sort of tried to clear their debts or their obligations, because if they have, if that conversion rate is high, what you've created is sort of a fractal system that as more people use it, they learn more about social credit systems and mutual debt clearing and some of your philosophies. And it's just neat to think about basically being pilled on something as you receive payment. That's, I think, a really elegant way to spread this meme.
Yeah. I don't think that there have been many takers yet, is the honest answer. It's on Optimism. You can look at the contracts, and it would be possible with a little bit of Python to make a pretty graph and see whose creation of on has led to the most sort of onward going transactions, which is probably something that I'll do a little bit further down the line. But this is the other thing to say then, is that like the timescale of the stuff is also radically different, right? Because you're not trying to make a quick buck, because there's no underlying scheme to exit to community or I don't know, like make a profit. The whole idea is to reinvent what profit means, right? Like, in fact, that was the reason that I got into blockchains in the first place a decade ago now, was that somebody told me, hey man, we're not here to get rich. We're here to redefine what wealth is. And it's taken me 10 years to figure out what that actually means to me at the level of code, right? I knew a few years ago that like wealth means having enough to share. It's like an old way of talking about it from, again, just studying some like different communities from around the world. But like, what does that look like at the level of code? Well, like on is my best estimation. But the point about it is that like, if it's true that blockchains will be around for a long time, then we have the luxury to think in very different timescales about this stuff. And, if only 100 people use on in the next 10 years, what does it matter to me, Because if you are, and I hope that you're right, I certainly think so, but of course I'm deeply biased, and you should never trust an author about their own work. I hope that it's a fractal scaling system, and I do hope that the meme of like receiving a payment, be like, oh, I have on, oh, damn, it's like not a good thing to have, or kind of maybe it's a good thing to have, because also when I have some, I can forgive my friends. But I don't know, is it like good or bad? Oh, maybe like good and bad aren't so like static, and like maybe they're relative and defined by the context that I'm in, or like maybe like right and wrong isn't like so clear cut. So I don't know, like I hope that that's the case. Whether it will be or not is it's not in my hands, right? And this is like another old story that like I really think that the best we can do with life is how we are when we're doing it. It's not the outcome, right? Like you find it in the Vedas. It's like two birds sitting on a branch. One eats the fruit and one just watches, and like be not attached to the fruit of one's actions, nor the actor, and it's repeated, across pretty much all of the traditions. Jesus also talks about this on the Mount in the sermon that I mentioned earlier. Like the fruit of one's actions is not, the action wasn't even you, and the fruit is not relevant to the state that you're in when you're doing it. That's what really seems to change the quality of one's heart in the work that we do. And I think that that's like the underlying reality of how one encodes values or programs values into money in this particular case, but into any work that you do. When you look at a painting that really moves you, or when you listen to a piece of music that brings you to great joy or an understanding of pain, or, there's so many things. When that happens, when one really encounters in an intimate fashion any particular piece of art or work that moves you, it's because there is something of the state of that person that is a part, right, that was imparted to the work in question. And the same is true for like code. The same is true for these things can be, deeply meaningful. And the way in which that happens is not the outcome that the thing achieves, right? It's not, it's how you are when you're doing it. And so that's kind of been my focus in this. And I think that again, like that process-based thing is critical because it actually speaks to the underlying like philosophy of this particular kind of money. As I said earlier, like if your thing is monetary premium, if it's all about the store of value and like Bitcoin is the new digital gold, right? Then like what that implies is a very static God, right? And I know that it's like quite a big leap from one thing to the other, but like if you go with me here, like you when you think that it's always about the store of value, you're always appealing to some external authority for the stamp of approval that this thing really is valuable and there's one true value and everybody should abide by that, right? And it's this like very static paternalistic notion of reality, of what is real, right? Whereas when you're thinking about clearing and when you're thinking about the relationality of things and the network and the graph of obligations that we all bear both to ourselves and one another and to the wider world in which we participate, then you're in the realm of process theology, right? It's like you're in the realm of like what it means to relate, what it means to make real by relationship. And I think that that's just it's a much more intimate and moving place to be, because it's not about dependency and obedience and fear, which is the whole static paternalistic story. It's about love, and it's about intimacy, and it's about vulnerability, and it's about honesty, right? Because like all of those things are premised on one's ability to be honest with yourself and with others. And when you really are, and this was Graeber's great point in Dead, he said like be honest. There's this moral ambivalence in everything, including your own character. And when you're just clear about that with yourself, then all of a sudden the space opens up for play, right? The space opens up for humor. And it doesn't become this serious thing of like trying to prove my God or my money or my way of doing things or the right way or the objective truth or any of this kind of stuff. It becomes like, how can I keep the game going? How can I experience love? And that is an endless question, right? There's no single way of answering that. There's no end to the ways in which that happens. So that's much more exciting for me.
Beautiful. I have more I want to say, but we're getting towards the bottom of the hour, so I got to lead you towards my final questions. I have two of them. The first is, if you are maximally successful in the next 10 years, what does the world look like, or what do these experiments look like? So take me forward to 2034. Honor has been massively successful, or your vision has come true. Paint us a picture of that world.
This is an old video that I like of Robin Williams. It's called "The World is Open for Play." And Graeber actually wrote an article about play and its relationship with evolutionary history. Why do animals play? And as I said, success for me doesn't look like everybody using honor, right? It looks like people no longer idolizing money and having a more playful relationship with it. Now, I don't want to define exactly what that looks like because I genuinely don't know. But I do think that if we had more playful relationships with money, we might have like richer and more meaningful relationships. And that's protopia for me, right? When the thing that I spend most of my time doing is tending to and caring for the quality of my relationships, that seems to be a really wonderful thing. And although it might be diffuse and like very difficult to quantify, that is like the world in which I want to live, right? And hopefully like Anna can help us get there by like pattern interrupting a few people along the way at critical junctions and saying like, hey, there is a playful way of interacting with all of this stuff. And that playful way opens you to a way of relating with yourself and with others that is playful, because money is so serious, right? We're so serious about money. And I understand why, right? Like I really, really do. I have a family. I have to support people. I have people that rely on me. I really understand like why money is a serious thing. But if we weren't so serious, just a little bit less serious about it, that would be successful, right? I would love that, because I think that it would serve our relationships greatly. And I think that is the way that you really find richness in the world. That's wealth means having enough to share. And that implies that you have to have people that you think are worth sharing with, right? Like, and if I had a little bit more time to tend to and care for my relationships and a little bit less time spent on trying to just make a ton of money, that would be great. And I think that Anna can like carry that meme. It can like spread that kind of like psychological attitude, at least, within certain like critical points in the crypto community, which is growing, which can hopefully kind of spread it more widely.
It's really beautiful. My last question is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say, Andy?
I don't think so. I think we've covered most of it. James P. Cass ends his book, Finite and Infinite Games, with this notion: there is but one infinite game. And that's lovely, I think, because infinity is this kind of like pluralistic concept by definition. There's so many different kinds of infinity, who knew? But there's this notion of oneness in it as well. And I think that that's probably the thing that keeps me most optimistic and playful, is the remembrance that it's all part of one process, right? Irrespective of the different stories and narrative streams that I see moving underneath each of the different coins that appears and disappears as time has passed, especially in the last 10 years. I've seen a lot of them, right? And I think a lot about the underlying stories. Meme coins in the most recent cycle really represent kind of the spiritual nihilism, right? And there's this authoritarian, paternalistic appeal to authority that one finds in certain ways of casting narratives around store of value, whatever it is. But the thing that really keeps me playful is this like remembrance of oneness. And oneness is not a static concept. It's not a number, right? Identity is actually the name for, when you talk about identity in maths, that means one. And I love that, because like it is a pointer to like what our real identity is. And I think that that's like a big part of what the underlying narrative work needs to coordinate us around, right? Is like remembrance of this shared identity without ever trying to enclose or predetermine what that is, allowing it like room to breathe and play. It's, the symbol which perhaps best captures this is the ENSO, because it's this one like perfect stroke, but it breaks at the end, and it illustrates that what is within is without, and it leaves space for God to escape. That's how they describe it. And I love that, because it's exactly what I've been trying to say throughout this whole episode, that like one shouldn't try and predetermine what these things are. And certainly it's not about pushing a particular narrative or saying there is a specific reason that we should coordinate, or there is a specific like singular version of the good or the true or the beautiful. But all of the like versions that we have are a part of like one collective stream. And if you have the courage and the honesty to drop your particular piece of truth and beauty and goodness in there with a touch of humor and a sense of the total absurdity of like the whole thing, then potentially it can really matter. It can really have an impact, and not necessarily in the ways that are easy to quantify, but like it's that kind of impact that I think is most lasting. And it's most lasting because it's based on a realization that who I am is not like defined by this specific space between birth and death, that who I am exceeds that, and that I share in that identity, which is not just, kind of limited in this particular like body and personality, although this body and personality plays enormously in the great stream of things. Yeah, so I hope that some of that is carried by on, and I hope that like if you listen to this, that you think about how weird it is that we can even like link those two concepts together. That there is the potential to have this kind of conversation when talking about money, because I don't think that it's been possible in a long time, in a very, very long time. And that fact is very exciting, even if you think that on is bullshit and you're not interested in taking on liabilities for people doing cool stuff for you. I won't feel offended if that's the case. But if you think a little bit more playfully about, oneness and your role in relating with it,
I love that. Well, what a place to end. If you're listening to this episode, you can check out Andy's work at x.com/cryptowanderer. You can check out honor.community, and then also there's a link in the show notes to these resources and also the kernel token studies on Honor. So thanks so much for joining the GreenPilled podcast. Really enjoyed this episode, Andy.
Thank you, Kev.
Wow, what an episode. You just heard from Andy Tudhope, and I am excited about him because he's just so thoughtful and such a beautiful thinker. I feel like I'm listening to an Alan Watts lecture whenever I hear from Andy, and Honor Not Money is just such a cool experiment in bringing his vision to the world. Thanks again for listening to the GreenPilled.network podcast. Again, we are featuring the people who are building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers who want to use crypto to bring positive some systems to the world, people like Andy Tudhope. While you're here, if you want to support the Greenpill podcast, you can collect this episode. Go to pods.media/greenpill and find all episodes and start collecting. Thank you to MMAonchain.eth and shroomchad.eth, and also to yes2crypto.eth and zeroknowledge.eth for collecting our recent episodes. There's a few other collectors also, but they don't have ENS addresses. So if you're a collector of the episode and you want to shout out on the podcast, then please send an ENS name. I'm not going to read your 16-character hexadecimal address. Again, go to pods.media/greenpill and start collecting Greenpill episodes today if you'd like to support the podcast. While you're here, might as well make an offering to our algorithmic overlords. Please subscribe, rate, and review. It really helps other people find the regenerative crypto economic movement. Well, this was a fun episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Andy is, just such an amazing thinker and doer. And I'll see you on the next one. Peace.